Hey, Nimi, thank you for coming in today. You have so many different accomplishments and contributions for global good, tech for good, uh, including, inclusion and diversity and equity. I mean, it spans pretty much everything. And I love the aspect of the interdisciplinary, and because that's really the nature of work today, to be really totally effective. And you're an entrepreneur. I'm an investor, so I understand all the entrepreneur side as well. So, and you just won this major achievement, the 2023 IEEE Biomedical Engineering Award. So, congratulations on this marvelous career that's continuing.
Thank you.
So one of the questions I'm always curious about, and my audience as well, is you do have this decades spanning lifetime, really, of contribution in so many different areas. What were maybe two or three inflection points that triggered this passion and commitment and innovation that you have today?
Yeah, I will say that a lot of my interest in what I do today um, was through, I guess, what I consider as an engineer, an unconventional path. I was a reluctant engineer, and if I had it my way, I would have gone into the arts. I was a musician, and I am still sometimes a musician. And I think that that was a space that I could have for myself to create, to aspire, to not have to have any boundaries. And I like that sort of open ended thought process. At the same time, I was very analytical. And I think that at the time I had good problem solving skills, which is obviously relevant to music. And, I took what I would say is a conventional path in college. I mean, I think there was an expectation from my parents that I pursue engineering or some sort of STEM career. And I really didn't enjoy it. I didn't connect with it in any way. And I think that in part it was context. It's like learning the scales on a piano, but not seeing the bigger piece and being able to appreciate what you need to know. And so I always use that analogy because when I think about interdisciplinary work or being inclusive, I realize that engineering, like the piano or any other instrument, is a tool. And once you can imagine that that is one of many tools that can be utilized to make a difference, that changes your perspective on education. That changes your perspective of what you can do. And I think that that was an inflection point for me. Another inflection point was working in women's health. I think that healthcare, cancer, all of these terminologies can be very two dimensional. And when it's two dimensional, it's hard to empathize. But if you are at the level of the problem, then you're able to better understand and appreciate it, the nuances of and the complexities of health and the lack of it. And growing up in a country where, I think the experiences I had at the time did not seem so unusual, but now reflecting back and being in the countries that I am, I think, gosh, I can relate. So having those experiences and then having the tools allowed me to keep synthesizing. So there are always these tools, right, that you learn, but when they're just in time, when they're informed by the larger context, it sparks your creativity, your passion, your desire to bring everybody to the table because creative talents are everywhere. And so I can't say there was one inflection point, but I can say that the kinds of things that made me evolve in my career have a lot to do with these basic ideas.
That's really, really fascinating, this sort of spectrum that you're being part of this career. You have this interest in music, but you're also very analytical. And then you go to college and you get immersed on the analytical side, but then you realize the context is important. and this aspect of women health, and it's sort of multidimensional with this multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary aspect. And I can see that pervade all of the work that you do. And then that drives your passion and commitment and so on. You know, you mentioned your family would be sort of pleased that you went into engineering. Do they have an engineering background or something like that? Or are there elements there that made you, you know, sort of invoke that, or was a catalyst for your analytical side?
Um, I will say that inherently, it's interesting that you bring that up. My mother is a musician. My father was an accountant. So perhaps you could argue that some of that trickled down. But I think the reason for why they pushed me into engineering is the notion that I want better for my children than I had for myself. And I think that engineering was meant to be emblematic of that. If I had said, I want to study music, it may not have been received as well, because the idea was, I want your life to be better than ours. So I think I did that because that's what I knew and I understood. I didn't think of music as a career. So there's both the interests of my parents, obviously, that I was exposed to and perhaps informed the way I think and do things. But the other was cultural, just that notion that I need to do things that give me security, that I have to be independent, which was not the case with, you know, my mother or her mother. And so there needed to be a shift. And she recognized that, which was pretty progressive at the time.
You know, so you decide to get into engineering, and you have a marvelous career in this area, but women are still underrepresented in engineering. And you know, what were your what was that path like? Was it more difficult in a sense, or were there some challenges along that path? Because it's still, we don't have enough balance in that aspect of inclusion and diversity and so on. I mean, I'd like to see your or hear about your thoughts on this area.
Well, definitely was challenging, right? We all want to see people who we can relate to. And I will say that I had many of those experiences, for one, coming to this country, right? I mean, you start to lose the number of relatable people that you can associate with. And then I think in engineering, I definitely felt that I was inferior because there were sort of two hits, right? One, that you are amongst the minority, but also this preconception uh, that perhaps women are not as good. So I think in both made me feel very insecure about what I did. And then I had a female role model and my advisor, and that made a huge difference. Just having someone you can relate to just makes a world of difference. There's implicit trust. And when you get advice, you know that it's coming from a place where they can relate to your own personal experiences and perspective. So that's what maybe was the first step in making me believe that I didn't necessarily need to conform or behave in ways that people expected. That didn't mean that it was extremely hard at every step of the way in my career, including promotion and tenure, because I expected failure. Somehow, I managed to get through all of that, and it was an arduous task. Nothing trivial about that, but I will say that as I progressed through that path, when you're part of a minority group, in some strange way, maybe not so strange, that you build closer bonds with a few people that you can relate to, right? It's a smaller group, it's a more intimate group. And I think that was where the strength came. So perhaps if, there are lots of people in the room, it would be hard to really connect. But if you have a small group of people, you're able to express more openly your thoughts, your feelings, and share perspective. So I think that's the other thing that actually, it was ironic, but it actually helped. Paradoxical, perhaps, but it actually helped in having the scaffold, the support to basically deal with the circumstances. There's not always a solution, but at least you can vent and you can share your experiences and commiserate. And the power of commiseration is amazing. So.
Yeah, excuse me. So I can see this story arc, and you have this aspect of it being a minority and a woman, and yet you had a mentor, and that mentor was able to provide this sort of extra platform, I guess, or an incentive path as well. And that's what you're doing too. I noticed throughout your career now, you're mentoring on so many different levels. So you're sort of paying it forward, right? And so I can see how that's guiding what you're doing today. But now, you're a professor at the Robert W. Carr, engineering and professor of cancer pharmacology and global health at Duke University. And you're co-program leader of the radiation oncology and imaging program at the Duke Cancer Center. And you also founded the Center for Global Women's Health Technologies in 2013. So can you talk about all of those elements, what led you to those roles? And then once you give some sort of narrative of the history of moving into these roles, then what are you focusing on, and what are some of the big challenges that you want to address?
That requires a pause. So, I talked about women's health, and I also think back to the work that I did in my graduate career and beyond. And while I'd like to do everything in the world to make it a better place, I also have to leverage my assets. And so the things, the words or the features or the common elements that emerged were I was working on cancer, I was focusing on women's cancers. I was looking at cancer from a biological perspective. I was looking at it from a translational perspective. I was looking at it from an implementation perspective. So I was dabbling in all these spaces. And, there's nothing like exposure. So when given an opportunity to be affiliated with a department or entity outside of your space, it gives you the opportunity to connect, to understand these different spaces, and to, in my case, I wanted to weave my own narrative. And I guess what I realized in all of this, and nothing was linear, right? This is all happening in a very convoluted way. I realized that, there's an underlying theme. Again, I think I mentioned it earlier. There's this vision, right? You want to make the world more equitable. So you have to start addressing the disparities to make it equitable. And the disparities can exist in health, but can also exist in the workforce that can address those inequities by closing the disparity gap. And so once I had that anchor, then it was a question of what are the skill sets? Who are the people I need to be, understand and work with? And how do you create a collaborative environment? Because you cannot do this by yourself. And I think that's what basically led me to create the center, but also to build these branches, because I knew that I might have a hub, but without these different spokes and different branches and different connections, it was not going to be very productive. And so while they didn't all happen in an intentional way, I think sometimes without necessarily being intentional, you do the things that intuitively make sense to you. So when I was asked to be a co-program leader, I said yes. When I wanted to do some biological work relating to response to cancer therapy in breast cancer, I realized that being in the pharmacology space would give me an opportunity to work with researchers there and thereby build relationships and open up new collaborations. Similarly, in global health, I didn't know what that meant. I mean, I wanted to be a global health researcher, but what did it really mean? So being in that space and understanding the perspectives of those researchers, again, influenced what I did. So I thought about people and how people inform aspirations. And once I had a notion of what it is I wanted to do, and that keeps evolving too, I then was able to reach out and see what it really means to be in pharmacology, to work with someone in researching pharmacology, what it's like to work with someone in global health. And now today, my center is about all of those things. It's about fundamentally, how do I improve women's health? Now that seems very broad, but then you can break it down. There's health inequity, there's educational inequity, there's of course gender inequity. So how do you tackle each of those? And for all of those things to happen, you need a number of skill sets and relationships. Think of that as a third layer. And that's where all of these entities come in and these collaborators come in to make it whole. So my collaborators span a spectrum from a researcher that is in immunology to a program planner or implementer in Kisumu, Kenya. And that's what I enjoy. It's lifelong learning. It never stops. And it's challenging, but very rewarding because you're never bored.
You know, that's really fascinating. So I can see you then building communities, and there's like a Venn diagram of overlap, but there are also concentric circles as well, as you're leveraging and amplifying almost like force multipliers of having these different communities. So I can see now the Robert W. Carr Professor of Engineering is the kind of analytical engineering side, the Professor of Cancer Pharmacology, as you mentioned, that's an important aspect of all of this. And then there's global health at Duke in the center there, and then the co-program leader, radiation oncology and imaging background. So there's going to be all of those aspects and AI machine learning and so on. And you have an anchor as an institute, and then you have these outreach programs all over the world, and that's where the global health technologies group that you, or the center that you created as well. So I can see all of these aspects coming together, about research and education and community and multiple disciplines and cultures and countries, and you, as you mentioned, equity and inclusion and all of those aspects. And I can see also this idea of marrying engineers and non-engineers, so you can do more. Because problems are complex, and the more interdisciplinary you can aspects you can bring to the table, then you can address some of these complex problems. So again, just amazing. You're very unique, and I wish more people would look at what you're doing, because it's such an amazing model, right? To get things done and to have this sort of fairness globally. But you're also into ventures and partnerships. You founded a company or co-founded a company called Kala Health Foundation. Can you talk about Kala Health Foundation?
Yeah, I will admit, I started a company before that, and we did fine, but it wasn't successful based on conventional, I guess, metrics. So when I think of starting a company, if I could, I would start a not-for-profit. The reason for that is that when I develop technologies for addressing, health disparities, I'm not suggesting you shouldn't profit or make money, because that's what keeps the world going. But I have an obligation to make things affordable. And sometimes when you want to do that, it doesn't align with the stakeholders who might give you that funding, right? That becomes very difficult. So I told myself that I need to be able to be competitive and apply for grants to continue to sustain a company that can essentially follow its mission, but at the same time not be strapped for funding. And so I was very successful in raising money through SBIRs, STTRs. I've raised more than 10 million that way, and it allows me to have autonomy. So that's what I mean when I say I wanted to create a not-for-profit, but I didn't want to make it such that I couldn't apply for these different funding mechanisms. And now I'm considering branching that out into a for-profit and not-for-profit. Um, so because of that interest, it was very hard for me to just license the technology out. I mean, I've designed it for a particular population, and you could always almost consider them as non-consumers, right? Which is not a big market in the conventional sense. So I had to essentially think about that. So that's why I started a company. I wanted to do things on my own terms. And it's a very slow process. I recognize that, right? Because if you don't have a huge influx of funding, or if you have to wait a year to get a grant, it can delay things. But I feel that I have been able to achieve the things I want, albeit at a slower rate. And I'm able to work closely with the countries and partners that I want to meet their needs and be small, focused, than just trying to distribute a lot of products. So that's not my mission, right? So it's not one product, I'm going to get it everywhere. It's more like one problem. Let's say it's gynecology, and I'm going to develop the tools to make that better. But I also need to raise the funding, and I'm going to think about the company structure in a way that allows me to be autonomous. So to make all of that happen, I had to do two things. I had to make sure that the ship was well built as possible to leave the harbor. And there are funding mechanisms now to universities that allow you to do that. I mean, of course, you have to make a case for it, which means that you can go all the way to getting regulatory clearance for a technology before it leaves the harbor. And once you get the clearance, of course, you have to leave the harbor. And so by doing that, I preemptively said to myself, how can I de-risk what I have? I did clinical studies all over the world, again, to seed the market, but to seed the market to the non-consumers. And by doing all of that a priori, when I went to the company, I knew that what I had to do now is get a good product, go through the process of going from a product prototype to design to product development, and then the regulatory pieces, and then, of course, commercialization. But it's just a different model, and one that required some sort of creative thinking that I think that would have been very hard to put together if I had just licensed it to someone. So the long story is I wanted to make sure I got it to the right end users. And I needed to figure out how to do that. And I would say the second piece of it, a very selfish perspective, is I'm okay if this doesn't work out, right? Because in the best case scenario, I save the world. In the worst case scenario, I have some important lessons to bring back to academia, to my students. So it's just a win-win.
I mean, it's this whole idea of translational research. I mean, I work with a lot of academic institutions. I'm part of a group called ACM, Association of Computer Machinery. We're definitely #1 in computing science. In fact, I have a board meeting coming up right after this. And I'm past chair of this what they call the practitioner board. So, you know, translational research is really important, right? There's research, but you got to do something with it ultimately if you want to benefit the Earth ecosystem. So I want to say more than humanity, so which encompasses people as well. And you're doing that, and what you're doing also reminds me of a group called the Terasaki Institute for Biomedical Innovation, and I'm telling you, there's so much confluence between what you're doing and what they're doing. I'll send you a link afterwards. I did an interview and a Forbes piece on them as well, and I think if you work together, yeah.
I would love that.
Yeah,
makes this conversation so wonderful, right? The world just gets a little bit smaller.
Yeah, and they're very much focused on translational research as well. And then they've got a mechanism in which to do this commercialization and so on, because ultimately you want it to be sustainable. So you're not just dependent on grants and maybe, you know, and really that's the way that you can get, you know, total sort of adoption globally if you make it sustainable on its own as well. And so I can see the company aspect or the Kela Health Foundation being part of that. You know, you developed a network of over 50 partners. So you have local, international academic institutions and non-governmental institutions and organizations, Ministry of Health. And I know you mentioned in your profile, you got Serbia, Peru, Brazil, Kenya, Mozambique, and so on. So I can see all of this coming together. And then tied with that, you have, more than 20 patents and 150 publications. And overall, you raised over 40 million. Do you work with the Gates Foundation at all? Have you?
The short answer is no. They do support cervical cancer. They have an organization called, it was Global Good and Intellectual Ventures. They've merged.
Right.
And they are working on cervical cancer with the intent of bringing deep learning as a way to make surveillance much easier and more efficient. I personally have not worked with them on this particular problem, but I completely appreciate what you're saying. I think that, when I think concept to impact, obviously scaling and sustainability is critical. And I think that that's an area where I could learn a lot. And I think that's one of the challenges is being able to even ask the questions, understanding what the questions are. And for me, part of that was going through this process. And I can appreciate what you say now because, as I said, it's very slow, very inefficient, and it's rewarding. But I wonder often in trying to make this sustainable and also scalable, what do I need to do to accelerate? Right? That's the challenge for me. And I think being able to get advice and understand the space better is, I think, an important piece that I see as a gap. And so I do recognize that, and I hope that that can change.
I mean, if you're interested, I do different things with members of the Gates Foundation, so I could do some introductions after the interview. If you don't have mechanisms, I know Mauricio Vecchione used to run the Global Good Lab and Fund, but he's moved on to Ad Astro and so on.
Right.
I'm actually a venture partner of Ad Astro. So.
Oh my goodness! I guess I don't know how you sleep.
or I should say venture advisor because I got to manage my time. But...
Okay. Yeah. He led Global Good, right?
Yeah. So I mean, I could see these our Venn diagrams are
right.
So post chat here, then I'm thinking of three entities. There's a group called DTGO out of Southeast Asia. They're part of the CP family, and I think they'd be interested in your work. And then, of course, the Terasek Institute. I know the three principals there. And then I could mention this to the Ad Astro folks too, as a potential. And then, so I could see different areas where I think, maybe there could be more collaboration and supporting what you're doing. So as the audience knows, these are unscripted. We're kind of brainstorming as we go.
This is amazing. I think I'm so appreciative of that because I think that you bring a perspective. I can share my narrative, but you can see it from a different perspective and where the challenges are that may not be obvious to someone who is, I will say, in some ways a naive academic.
I'm really fascinated by these different devices you've created. There's technology innovation for cervical cancer prevention. And can you talk more about these different devices? And there's a number of them, or, you have this TriSolve as well, but you have this Colposcope, I guess. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but you got a number of things that being working on, like your Telescope. Can you talk about how they came about, how they're building out globally, and what are the gaps where maybe somebody in the audience will say, you know what, I can accelerate that by learning about what you're doing, right? So
yeah. So I think that one way to describe it holistically is the continuum of care. So every time I go out and and do one thing, you find out that there's something else missing. And in order to reach you know, the the to do what's best for the patient, you have to address the continuity of care. So coming back to the pocket colposcope, I mean, these are based on stories, right? I was in Tanzania, and a gynecologist there who's running a cervical cancer screening program said, women hate speculums, and we can't afford colposcopes. Can you do something about it? And so the original, I think, vision was, let's bring them two together. Let's make a speculum-free colposcope. And that was dead on arrival because I was trying to make a very complex problem simple. But then that sort of bifurcated. I said, okay, can't do everything at the same time. Let's focus on a technology that can really bring the colposcope into someone's pocket. And he also said something very interesting. He said, can you build a camera that can just be put inside, the vaginal canal? And that's, some of these words just stay with me. And then I remember coming back to the US and talking to a colleague in environmental sciences, and he showed me this little slender camera that he had purchased from Taiwan. And I put the two together and said, gosh, a tampon colposcope. That's what I originally called it. So point of care tampon, colposcope, basically. That's how the word, sort of the pocket word, came about. And so it's just serendipitous moments when, I had this concept in my head and all of the pieces came together. And lo and behold, we made a colposcope. I'm very proud of it. That is as good as the best colposcope on the market. And it's a very simple way of thinking about things. Don't do sustaining innovations. Don't build on something that's been built before. Build something new. So colposcopes are built around speculums. You got to be outside, not inside, because that speculum that was invented 200 years ago dictated everything that came after it. But what if you said, I'm going to just, start afresh, have a new canvas? How would I do things? How would I make it women-centered? Because everything that was developed for gynecology was developed by men. And so that's how the pocket colposcope came about, and very excited about that. But then my vision was to make it speculum free. So again, I think that going to these countries was eye-opening, in that it's not enough to just build a technology, portable or effective or whatever. You have to have, people have to use it. There has to be demand. And if there's fear and trepidation, that's not going to bode well. And one of the biggest challenges, and it's not unique to low and middle income countries, I would say it's universal, is the fear of a gynecological exam. The speculum is not something you can write home about, and many women don't go. And I see that here, I see that in other countries. And I thought, what if a woman could be empowered to reverse the gaze from the physician to herself? What would that do? And that's how the coloscope was born. Very, very difficult project. I mean, there's no precedent, there's no benchmark to tell you this is the pressure, this is how long it has to be. It was all empirical. And sometimes it was, myself being the guinea pig. But lo and behold, it did work. And it was amazing, amazing. I can't tell you enough about how amazing it is. I mean, just maybe on a more personal note, I remember testing it myself and thinking, oh my goodness. I think I shared that picture with everyone I knew. So it got a lot of awards, as it should have, highly recognized. Both were, and before I get to TriSolve, because there's a similar theme here, while it got all these awards, there was this discordance. There was a reluctance for many people to use these technologies. And I realized something that I wasn't aware of before. When you build something completely new, when it's not the way, it doesn't look like what you're used to doing, it doesn't work like what you're used to having how things work, there is, if you're not an early adopter, that's a problem. So, for example, one thing that I was told by a particular provider is, women are scared, they'll never use it. Or this is too different from what I'm used to. I can't operate it, even though they were operating a much more complex device. So those are the kinds of feedback I was getting, which is also another reason why I had to shepherd this, right? It wasn't a simple thing of, okay, I've got this technology, let's sell it. There had to be some sort of process by which I had to convince the providers or the program planners that this was a good thing. So I just wanted to say that in thinking about these innovations, we were very much patient-centered. But in that process, we realized that change is hard to make. And now what we're doing is we're working directly with the people that will use these products to skip this inertia that usually happens when something you develop is not something that people can associate with. Yeah, so that's been another reason for this company to raise money to distribute these tools to those communities to get feedback from the end user and get their perspective on what they think. And the results have been transformative. What we've heard is very different from what they feel. And so how do you do that without being able to get these technologies off and send it to the people who need it? So with respect to treatment, I will say that Trisolve was born out of a trip to Zambia. So there is very little surgery. There's only like one person. Actually, this is true in Kenya as well. If you go to the western part of Kenya, there's perhaps one surgeon that can do a hysterectomy, probably no colposcope, and no expert providers to do any of the things that you want, and certainly no radiation. So you just got run-of-the-mill chemotherapy, which we know very well is not effective. So what do you do? So I saw ethanol, on the table, being used to disinfect the table, and I thought, well, they can get access to ethanol. Let's use it. Seems pretty simple, but ethanol, while it is very, very effective, is very leaky. So it has actually been used in the US and other places for treating inoperable cancers, but not very effective because it leaks all over the place, and therefore, especially if you have a stiff tumor, and it doesn't really do a good job. So another serendipitous moment, we wanted to put a polymer, something that could make it viscous, like cornstarch. And we looked in the polymers that were considered by the FDA as safe, and we came across this ethyl cellulose polymer. My student did. And in our efforts to make it viscous, we were cleaning off the ethyl cellulose and ethanol in the sink and realized it became a gel. And we're like, what? And it turns out that it went through a phase change. We didn't even know. And so lo and behold, you have this little capsule that forms in the tissue that sequesters the ethanol. So it's liquid when you inject, but when you put it in, it's like this cotton-like gel. And the ethanol basically is confined to that. So by creating just like tuning the size of the gel, you can tune where you treat without the off-target toxicity, but also enough of a concentration to treat effectively. It was remarkable. And so we've been building on that. We've been using it as an immunomodulator with a lot of success. We've been using it as what I call a double hit. So you have polymers that carry chemo agents, right? And what if you could have a polymer with ethanol and the chemo agent where you can, destroy the membranes with the ethanol, right? Basically cause necrosis and just decimate the tissue. And then you have the cytotoxic agent that can go in and actually kill the cells, prevent them from, proliferating. So these are all the avenues that have come out. And I think that you can't get that in a lab. You have to go out there and just look for those elements that seem like they're so obvious, so simple. They may not be, but to come back and use that inspiration to come up with your new tools. And that's why I feel like in a way it's like art. It's you have these skill sets, but you have a blank canvas. And if you're the artist, you have to be inspired. The pocket colposcope, the coloscope, Trisolve, these are all inspired by experiences in the world. And all I have to do is observe. and listen. And they pretty much tell you how to invent. So that's the long and short of the story, perhaps more than you had asked to know, but there you go.
That's a great narrative. And I know that you're using deep learning with your pocket colposcope. And that's what that does is, as you know, in your profile, you mentioned that it makes it easier than for, you can have more not really super specialists being able to deploy it, which means it's great for the global south and much more sort of deployment capability. Are you using deep learning as well in your telescope?
That's the vision. We're using it now with the pocket colposcope. We just got a grant to do that in Kenya. Yeah, so we're developing these deep learning algorithms as assistive technologies to health providers for telemedicine, because again, there's an adoption phase, right? And we think that because there's no standardization, there's high turnover, you start by making it assistive, and then maybe even for annotation, which is done a lot in the space, and then move into perhaps having it be the primary tool as people adopt and accept its value. Just like with the pocket, right? You kind of have to deploy it and see how people use it, work with them to modify it, and then ultimately say, this is a tool that could be used as standard of care. So I think that that's kind of how we're approaching the deep learning process as well. And ideally, it would first serve as an aid. So we're doing two sorts of things, right? So we're doing, deep learning for the purposes of diagnosis, but we're also doing a lot of unsupervised image segmentation as a way of annotating these images so that people can be trained quicker. There's a lot of anatomical features that can confound your diagnosis, that people don't often know about them. And usually there's just a slew of images on a website saying, this is what things look like. But in reality, somebody is annotating for you. How can we do what that expert does? So it's deep learning is one element, but really in the bigger space, it's about understanding what the expert does, knowing that there's some things they see that are important, but also there are things that they don't see that the deep learning algorithm will see. The other is to see how they even describe the images, what they do with those images physically, what do they identify as being important? What do they circle? And then trying to develop the tools to automate that process. So thinking about deep learning and image segmentation both as a training tool, an assistive tool, and maybe for diagnosis, and ultimately a standalone tool that can bring experts to the hardest to reach places for cervical cancer screening.
There's quite a bit of work being done in this area, especially on the deep learning side, and then marrying that with some kind of imaging capability. There's a professor by the name of Alex Wong. He's the Canadian Research Chair for AI medical imaging. He's at the University of Waterloo.
Mm-hmm.
I would recommend, I don't know if you ever talked to him, but he's done lots of work in this area. And in fact, he even has a startup called Darwin AI, where they use it for other applications, but he's also done quite a bit in the medical space. And the other, and so he's a professor.
His name again, please.
What his name is Alexander Wong.
Alex Wong. Okay.
Yeah, at University of Waterloo. A very young researcher, but it's done extraordinarily well. And he's always at NeurIPS, like publishing things at NeurIPS, which is like the #1 or one of the top AI conferences. There's a company called Radlogics, which again has done a lot of work in this area, and they already have deployed tools. But I think if you married your hardware aspect, where you've developed the hardware, and they've got all of the back end, they definitely have all of the classification data and things like that out there. I recommend to reach out to them to see if you can do some kind of collaboration, because they got all the other side, and they got all of the support for clinicians as well, all done. It's a 360 system. And I think by collaborating, you can even accelerate what you're doing now. So, and if you want, I know both parties I can do introductions if you wish,
That
right?
would be wonderful. In fact, I've been writing down all of these names, so it would be wonderful if that's, yeah, because I think you've mentioned um, Maurizio. How do I say Maurizio? Um,
Terasaki Institute.
Terasaki, now Rad Logic, Alex Wong. I don't know if I've missed anything. I think those are the four I remember. So yeah, I mean, I've been trying to write as I hear you. So yeah, it would be great to have introductions. I think that always helps. So thank you for offering that.
Yeah, and then once the article goes out and the interview goes out, then I can share it to my communities, and I'm
Okay.
sure there could be some additional interest. I did mention I can also do one with the people I work with within the Gates Foundation, and
Okay.
maybe there's some ways to accelerate what you're doing as well.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
The other thing which I find fascinating in your work, together with all the awards you won, it's just a remarkable list of awards. But this idea of Invisible Oregon, can you talk about Invisible Oregon?
Yeah. So I think I mentioned earlier, a tool is only as good as, if someone uses it. And what I learned with the Coloscope and using it in Ghana, Peru, and the US, both at the home and the clinic for self-use, is that maybe 10% of the women, no matter where they were, in some places less, knew even what they were looking at. They had no idea, right? And here's the portal to life, a very important part of your body. And if you're unaware, how do you take care of it? And I think my colleague says it well. If you have a mole in your skin that looks cancerous, you have to go to the doctor. But if you can't see it, how would you know? So that inspired me to think about a way to make that a narrative that could be shared with a broader community. And the word, I thought, invisible organ was apt because it is truly invisible. And so what happened was a few things that came out of those trips. One was um, I wanted to do an art exhibit on basically this important narrative, and wanted to see how this could be expressed in different ways, stories. As I told you, I've always been interested in art and storytelling. And so I approached a colleague in the Center for Documentary Studies and asked her how we might do this. And we decided that we were going to solicit art from, artists that in a space that who are interested in this narrative. And we got works from all over the world that we were able to exhibit at the Rubinstein Center at Duke University. And I think they had somewhere upwards of 500 people show up over the course of 3 hours. Um, and then it was there for a month, and many people visited. And I think then we moved it as a digital gallery with the stories of the various artists. And that was my first effort to say, what are the things I can do to build community? And then I recruited a documentarian into my center, actually a student who was interested in doing her thesis. And she said, we should make this into a documentary. So we worked with my colleague in the Center for Documentary Studies, the student who's now at MIT in the media studies world. And we created a documentary, a 45-minute documentary on the Coloscope, on cervical cancer, our experiences internationally, having different individuals speak about their experiences, just, as a story, but with an anchor, Coloscope Invisible Organs, called Invisible Organ Documentary. And that was featured in one of the largest HPV conferences, which is very exciting. I don't know how many people appreciated it, but then since then, it's been screened by many students and individuals at high schools, at universities. So ultimately, what I realized is, like a course in a classroom, not unlike a course in a classroom, it's educational. It's a way of imparting information, sharing knowledge, not in the conventional way, but being able to get it out to the community, having safe spaces, but in that process, being able to create awareness And as simple as you have a cervix, take care of it. And it's surprising how few people know about it. So that's what the invisible organ is. It's meant to be an educational initiative that is not one-dimensional. It's inspired by technology, but it includes storytelling, it includes art, and any other type of media that can bring that across. And if you look at the website, there are pictures and there are stories by artists, by photographers, from Morocco or Ghana. The idea is let's collect those stories. Let's, curate the site of just the beautiful things that connote women's health and reproductive health.
I can see the value of what you're doing, and especially it'll resonate with Gen Z, which is people born, or Gen Z, as you'd say in the U.S., those born from 1997, and the Alpha generation from 2012, and including millennials as well. So I mean, I could see all of this being very attractive to these groups. I can also see it integrating with the work that's being done on the metaverse. There's a metaverse called Impact District, which is really about welfare and care. And there's another one called the Translucia metaverse. They're somewhat in stealth yet, but you'll see more about it. But they're very centered on well-being. So I could see the integration of what you're doing, especially on this invisible organ work, where there's narratives and stories, and then you can have avatars that can help in that storytelling in an immersive environment. And keep in mind that the work on this kind of metaverse is not just the meta version of the metaverse, but it's a much more all-encompassing digital representation of what's out there, and incorporating any kind of accessibility device. So even feature phones and so on. So it doesn't have to be complex headwear. So there's quite a bit of investment going into that area. Again, I can do some introductions if you're interested, and maybe start some of this early collaboration. We don't have that much time left, and so I got to get to these last couple of questions. I'm really fascinated by your work with Ignite, this idea of train the trainer. And the reason is I'm working with a lot of CEOs right now who are very much working on diversity inclusion, working with the trainer idea, this mentorship concept where other students can mentor other students and so on, cascading mentorship, and this is going to help with diversity inclusion. But I could see that in your models. Can you talk more about this Ignite program that you created? It's just fascinating.
Yeah, so it's sort of it also is part of this umbrella of the different ways of educating. So when my students do design, they're in this elite university, they're able to solve problems. For example, during COVID, right, when there were lack of resources, students could immediately start designing solutions, alternate solutions. But as I am working with collaborators to design solutions for them, and hopefully with them. But why aren't we giving these skills, or why aren't their skills being taught to the students or the people who are at the level of the problem? So like everything else, it's a big experiment. So I applied for funding, sent some students to Kenya, asked the teachers there in the school, what do you want? What do you want your students to learn that they aren't able to learn? And they said, tinker, being able to build things. I said, great. What would they want to know? So they surveyed the students, then they said, we need light to study at night. They don't have reliable access to electricity. So I taught a class to students of design thinking for community development. How do you build tools that can solve a problem? I said, I don't want you to build a product. That's not my goal here. And besides, products take a long time. What you can do is create a product. That's a curriculum. That you can do in a semester. So they created a product. They went to Kenya, to Uhuru Bay. Everything they had imagined had to be scrapped and start. They had to start over, but they knew fundamentally what they were trying to do. They had 50 students, all girls. They learned how to make a renewable energy flashlight. It's still being used today. It was done in 2014, and now it's a club. And they continue to develop flashlights and other solutions. But the idea was they could take this and immediately apply it to a problem that they had. They didn't have to go and get, batteries for a lamp that barely worked. So that's what inspired it. And then we expanded to other countries. I tend to do that a lot, like rapid prototyping, try it in different countries and learn quickly what happens. We hit a sweet spot in Guatemala. I had a student who took my class and said, I've got to do this in Guatemala. She's very, entrepreneurial. She set up a foundation in Guatemala. She's Guatemalan. And she learned about this renewable flashlight program. And she said, why don't we do water? So we designed a program around clean water. And it's now been scaled to about 500 schools and reached over a couple of thousand students. And the idea was to go to the indigenous community around Lake Atitlan and teach them about water and how to build solutions to clean water. And it turns out that they had reason to believe that the water was dirty because of spiritual reasons that they, or supernatural reasons that they had no control over, or they were told something different than what was actually the truth. And organizations were making policies that they could not contribute to. So through this whole process, what happened was they worked with a local NGO and they started to educate the community about the issues with water, to actually influence policy change because they gave people voices that they didn't have. And so I think that's the power of this very simple initiative. And now it's got a life of its own. And so we now are doing it locally here to essentially bring that to museums as a way of being able to tinker, but around the idea of doing something for good. And it doesn't necessarily have to be something halfway across the world. It could be for someone here who's at the level of the problem. But that's the fundamental notion. Provide context and you will learn the tools.
I can see this now being part of something called Startups Without Borders, which is a very inclusive global program. There's another program called Good Wall, where maybe this would be a great fit.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Good Wall.
Good Wall, okay.
And then also there's something called the Innovation Factory, which is part of the ITU Open Innovation Platform for AI for Good. I can see this also tying in with the Imagine Cup from Microsoft. So just a number of ideas. We're down to the last minutes, and so we've got about 2 minutes left. So I encourage the audience to take a look at all of the recognitions you receive, because it's just a small indication of the magnitude of the work you're doing and the impact it's having. I mean, it is just remarkable, and it's also meaningful. So really, audience, take a look. And now to the last question. We covered so many different areas. Do you have some recommendations you want to provide to the audience? And that's the last question.
Do as many things as you can. Divergent thinking. Don't make judgments before you've tried it. Keep all doors open. And you might land upon something that you really like and really care about, and then you'll figure out how to do it. What I can tell my kids.
That's marvelous and wonderful advice for the audience. And Amy, I really appreciate you coming in. You're just doing outstanding, remarkable work, and it's continuing, and it's making the planet better and the ecosystems of the world better, and definitely for the benefit of humanity. So thank you again, and sharing some of your insights with our audience today.
Thank you. And I look forward to all those introductions. It was a pleasure meeting you, Steve, and I really enjoyed this. And thank you so much for all of the advice and recommendations. I'm very excited to pursue them.
Okay, take care. All the best.
Bye. Take care.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the brand called You Videocast and Podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for The Brand Called You.